Welcome back to the program. This is the best in anomalous talk radio. This is Midnight in the Desert. I'm your host, Dave Schrader. For the next 2 hours, we're going to go into a journey of the mind. Mind controlled by music. You know, I love the concept of this because I got to tell you, is there anything more powerful than music? I've especially been kind of entranced in it even more so lately, watching some flashback videos and things that have popped up and realize the type of emotion and thought process that goes behind music and how some of it can transport us literally through time. You can almost feel the sensations of a place you were 30, 40 years ago when a certain song comes on the radio. It puts you back in that mindset, in that spirit, in that humor or emotion that you associate with that. Music is an amazing and powerful medium. And it has certainly been one, as I've been open with on the show, that has lifted my spirits from the darkest depths of hell. It has helped me pull out of suicidal tendencies and horrible throngs. And music has the ability to change people, thoughts, ideas. But is there more behind that? We're going to talk with our guest, Mark Devlin. He's a UK-based club and radio DJ, a music journalist and author. And as a DJ, he's played gigs in over 40 different countries. In 2010, he underwent what he refers to as a conscious awakening, bringing a new awareness of what's really going on in this world. His special area of interest was how this ties into the mainstream music industry and the way in which A-list artists have been used to manipulate and mind control the masses in line with a much larger agenda. In his groundbreaking book, Musical Truth, he goes deeper into this subject. He's here to talk with us this evening. Thank you so much for being here with us, Mark.
Hey, Dave. Good to be with you, man.
It's very early in the morning. As a music guy, I'm sure that's not your forte, right? This is love, rock and roll, and staying up late and sleeping in late. That's the way life should be.
Well, it used to be, but family life has put paid to that, and also ceasing doing the DJing. If you caught me 10 or 20 years ago, this would have been a problem for me. Or I would have been rolling in from a club around about 6 o'clock in the morning, which is what it is here now. But these days, no, getting up at this time is no problem. I do it for my day job anyway, and I'm at my sharpest in the mornings. So you probably caught me at the best time of day now.
Talk to us, if you would. I mean, your work and kind of collaboration with music. Being a DJ is an amazing thing because you've really got to have a feel and an energy for the way music ties together. When did this become a fascination for you, just music overall?
Well, it was in my teenage years. I bought my first record when I was 5, actually, which was Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody, first time around. So I got turned on to music in the very early days through a program that used to be on BBC Radio 1 here called Pick of the Pops, which became the UK Top 40. It was basically the chart show. And it used to go out on a Sunday evening. And when I was very young, my mum used to give me a bath on Sunday evenings with the radio on in the background. And that turned me on to all the pop music that was around in the 70s going into the 80s. And that sparked a fascination with pop music generally. I was into whatever was in the charts. And then in my teenage years, I met a friend at school that was into black music. So soul, funk, early hip hop, early house music. And I sort of fine-tuned my tastes and got into all of that and decided that I was so excited by this music and had such a passion for it that I wanted nothing more than to share that with other people. And so the natural thing was to become a DJ and just put that great music out there to as many people as possible. So not saying it was easy, you know, becoming a successful DJ is a very arduous path, but through many years, I managed to achieve that and started living the dream of playing all this great music. And I was fortunate enough to get to travel all over the UK and to different countries. And I did that for many years, and it became my profession. It became my main passion in life. I identified myself as a DJ. It was the only thing that was really important to me. I just lived for the next party, the next radio show. But then, as you mentioned in the intro there, round about 2010, something happened to me in my life and my perspectives started to shift and my perception of what this world is really about started to change, and life has not been the same over the course of the past 10 years, but I wouldn't change it for anything.
Well, I'd like to go back, if you don't mind, before we talk about the evolution for you. Let's talk about traveling 40 countries, music. It is an international language, right? I mean, it's something that you can bring to the masses that they don't need to even speak the language. The beat, the rhythm, the energy, and sometimes just the voice itself, whether it's even understood, has kind of a hypnotic, magical ability to transcend communication gaps and bring people into a really kind of a different realm.
Well, that's right. It depends on the genre of music. I mean, with hip hop, which is very heavy on the vocabulary, that might not be felt so much in countries that don't speak English. But certainly with house music and dance music, it's all about the rhythm. It's all about the vibe of the track. And anyone can tap into that. You know, it seems to be this primal state within humanity that responds to certain rhythms in music, which is how these styles can be popular all around the world. And indeed, dance music is. And you mentioned also in your intro there how hearing a record from decades ago can just take you instantly back to where you were when you first heard it. And you can get back into that mind state that you were in, that emotional state. You remember people you were hanging out with, places you used to go. Nothing can transform you back there like music can. So it does have this incredible power. And also, I often make the point that a really well-crafted record of 3 or 4 minutes, particularly in the hip-hop genre, where it's all about the lyrics once again, can have the impact of watching a 4-hour documentary or reading a 500-page book. You know, you get across in 3 to 4 minutes, if it's done properly, a message that is going to stay with someone potentially for the rest of their days. So it's a very, very powerful genre, and I can see how I was drawn to it in the early days. I can also see how the controllers of this world, those that run things, would want to have harnessed the corporate music industry and be in absolute control of what it's used for. And of course, this is exactly what has happened.
You know, I'm fascinated by autobiographies, and especially where it comes to musicians and comedians, actors. And I had the strangest one come across. I just got done listening to John Taylor's biography from Duran Duran, Billy Idol's biography, and one that was recommended to me was Andrew Ridgeley of Wham, of all people.
I just finished reading that last night.
Unbelievable story, right? And it's so fascinating to listen to this, but then to hear, they went to China, and it was, they didn't even know where the kids could even understand a word they were saying. How do you sell tickets to this foreign country to these shows? And it was so fascinating. They said the way they watched the audience, and that the students and people that weren't national, that didn't live there, they could dance. But I love the point that they said at one point, this older man made his way out and started dancing, and like police started surrounding him, and they're like trying to get him to knock it off. And then they ended up taking him off. And he said, it was weird during the show. We're watching this and we're like, this man knew what he was up against, but the music touched and moved him in such a way that he let go, even though he knew what might be waiting for him. And Andrew Ridgeley says it could have been a beating or perhaps even worse, all for just letting the music take control. And then you see, as you're talking about how politics and the government or these groups will control the music in the way that they affect and impact people. And I love the fact that I think he said when they tried to get the kids out there interested, they released like a 4 or 5 song disc or tape. And on one side was the English versions of the songs. The other side was the Chinese version of the song. And one of their songs where they're talking about just being, young and youthful and enjoying life and not having a job, he was reciting the lyrics, which I thought were great. And he's like, women are not equal to men yet, but they should be. And all men should get up early to their jobs. And he said it was just this total communistic attempt to manipulate the people. And it was funny to hear that he said we were well aware of this, but they came to listen anyway. And they found something in the music, even when it had been changed, to attach to, and that's powerful.
Yeah, I've just finished reading that book. My wife bought it for me for Christmas, so I've just been burning through it. And I was hoping he might shed some light on what happened to George Michael eventually, but of course he glosses over it and kind of reinforces the official version of things. But yeah, there are some good stories along the way. It certainly takes me back to my youth and being carefree. Remember those days? It's been a minute for me.
I do. And for what it's worth, and I don't know if you have a side on this, but doing this show and a true crime program, after reading the book, delving into the white rabbit hole of destiny that is the internet, I uncovered things I did not realize. And we plan on actually doing a true crime episode on the death of George Michael, because I'll tell you what, after what I've seen and read, oh man, I think there's a murder involved. I don't know. Where do you stand on that at this point?
Well, I've actually looked into it in a fairly major way. It does form a big part of Musical Truth Volume 2, my book, and I've done some public lectures on it as well, concerning all the elements of what appears to be predictive programming, foretelling what came to happen to George Michael. So there are a ridiculous number of references in films and TV shows leading up to Christmas Day 2016, which is when George Michael was discovered dead in bed, we're told. Incidentally, I don't know if you heard, but on Christmas Day 2019, just a few days ago, George Michael's sister Melanie was discovered dead on Christmas Day in very suspicious circumstances. Although the police are saying that they're not treating the death as suspicious, which is exactly what they said about George Michael, and it's what they said about Dolores O'Riordan of the Cranberries when she turned up dead in a bathtub in a London hotel a few years ago. And this always seems to be the case. You know, rock stars, and in this case their relatives, turn up with no explanation given as to how they died, but all you get is a statement from the police that, don't worry folks, it's not suspicious. Oh, that's a relief then. Oh, everything's okay.
Well, then you and I will need to connect again in a few weeks when we investigate this for the story, because I'd love to have you share some of the insights with listeners on that. But going into the books and talking about this, I want to talk now about your awakening and what happened to you 10 years ago.
Well, it was a process which probably started around about 2007, 2008, when I started to realize, you can call me a late developer, I started to realize that the world was not quite the way it was presented to us by the mainstream media and by politicians and by the official word on everything. I was just looking around and seeing all the injustice in the world that never seemed to end, you know, perpetual war and poverty and famine and all this. And then I was looking at all the chaos and carnage that was happening and all these so-called terror events that were going on, and just looked at the massive gulf that there was between the elite rich of this world and regular folk who are living on the breadline, you know. And I had all these questions about how this can be allowed to take place. And at the same time, I was getting turned on to alternative authors and researchers, largely by my who had always read these types of books. And he put me on to the work of David Icke. And up to that point, my attitude towards David Icke had been the same as most people in the general British public, which was to write him off as this nutter, this poor man that used to be a BBC presenter, but lost his mind somewhere along the way and went a bit crazy.
He was a well-respected presenter, and we just had David on the show here in the last year.
Okay. Yeah, well, I remember watching him on BBC Sport programmes, Grandstand, and he used to be on this Saturday morning kids programme called Saturday Superstore. And then round about 1990, you know, he says he underwent this transformation. And the way it was framed, the way it was presented to the British people, largely through this Wogan TV chat show appearance in 1991, was to convince everyone that he'd lost his mind and gone off the rails. And so my dad encouraged me to take a fresh look at the stuff that he was saying, and not necessarily to write him off as a nutter, just like we'd been trained to do so. And so I started looking at his material, and it made a lot of sense. It answered more questions than it posed, and I find that's always a useful process. And he was giving me reasons for why the world seemed so crazy and haphazard and chaotic. And I came to realize that it's chaotic and it's unjust by design, because we have this elite ruling class that we're not told about, that are operating behind the shadows outside of the public spotlight, and they are controlling and directing every aspect of our lives. And I realized that this filters down all the way to entertainment, and particularly the music industry. So we spoke there about the incredible power that music can have over people's lives and their emotions and their perceptions. Well, if you are a psychopathic power elite hell-bent on controlling and subjugating the human species, then you're not going to pass up the opportunity to harness something as powerful as that and have it in your grip and direct every aspect of, what it does. So I realized that this group, having taken control of politics and big business and the world of science and academia and the military and social engineering, is not going to have left alone the entertainment industry. And so this was a real wake-up call for me. And I thought, my God, what is it I've been a part of for the past 20 years? I need to fully delve into this and find out more about it. And that started me on my path of research around about 2010, which I would say is when the real work happened for me. And so I took a deep dive down the rabbit hole of the true nature of the corporate music industry. That was my specialist area of interest. I was looking at other things. I was looking at, the truth behind 9/11, and I was looking at the banking industry scam and the fake illusory nature, all these other conspiratorial aspects. But my specialist area was the music industry, because I didn't see too many other people doing it. There were videos on YouTube. There was a great site called vigilancecitizen.com, which has taught me a lot about signs and symbols and how they're used for subliminal influence. But there wasn't really any full-time researcher that I could see that was out there breaking down how the music industry really works and putting all these different puzzle pieces together. And so I kind of saw a vacancy for me to step up and be that guy, having had the grounding in the music industry, having been a DJ, having been a music fan for so long, knowing so much about it, and now coming to know so much about conspiracy issues. I thought, well, this is what I need to be doing with my life now. And for the past 10 years, it has been. So the first 5 years were spent putting everything together, which eventually formed the basis of my first book, Musical Truth Volume 1. So that's 5 years worth of research in that. And having reached the end of Volume 1, I realized that was only part of the story that had been told. And there was much more. So that became Volume 2. And it's still not over, because this stuff never ends. And I have new information coming across my radar literally daily. So there is going to be a Volume 3 at some point, but I will be taking a bit of a breather before I dive into that one fully.
Oh, I'm curious, by kind of delving into the conspiratorial angle of these stories in the music industry, if they have such power to kill musicians and alter world events, by blowing the whistle on them, Mark, are there concerns for you that, that maybe you're going to draw a bullseye on your own back?
Well, I've always tried to be an under-the-radar flyer to a very large extent. So I tread a fine line between getting the information out to interested people, but not flagging myself up too much. So I'm very, very far from David Icke's status. And I've never really wanted to be filling stadiums the way he does. And I don't really want to be anywhere near that level, because you do draw undue attention to yourself when you get to that stage. So I've just crossed 10,000 subscribers on my YouTube channel, which is not a huge amount, really, compared to many other channels. So it appears to be confirmation of the fact that I'm able to reach people that are interested, because I get emails daily from around the world from people telling me that they've come across my work, they've seen my books, they've seen one of my lectures on YouTube, and they thank me for what I do and maybe give me some information that's useful to me for the future. But I'm not attracting the kind of unwanted attention that I would be if I had 100,000 subscribers and I had 2,000 people turning up to one of my talks, as opposed to the 40 or 50 that usually come. So I think that's a fairly good position to be in. I think people that are searching for my work or are searching for the type of information that I put out are able to find me. I'm easily found on the internet, but I'm not drawing too much flack to myself. That's the way I like it, and that's what I intend to keep going with.
Very good. I appreciate that. We do have links up for our guest, his website, his books. You can check it out by visiting midnightinthedesert.com, clicking on his name, Mark Devlin. You'll find that information there. All right, once you kind of have this awakening and you start realizing this again, how do you start to draw the line? Because some conspiracies, as you know, can lead you to dead ends, can leave you hanging because there's not enough information to back it as a truth or a half truth or whatnot. How do you start to draw that defining line for yourself?
Well, it certainly is a difficult process. There's a lot of disinformation out there that's deliberately put into the realm to lead researchers up the garden path and up to dead ends. There's a lot of misinformation, which is where people have the best of intentions. They don't want to mislead, but they just get things wrong. And if you constantly repeat misinformation, you're going to tarnish your reputation as a researcher, because when it can be shown to be erroneous, stop trusting you. So you do have to have a certain amount of confidence with what you put out before you put it out there if you're going to maintain any kind of a reliable reputation. So it's a case of double checking and triple checking where possible and corroborating sources and just trying to confirm that a piece of information has validity to it. I did worry about this a lot when I first went public with what I'm now doing. And I thought to myself, you just take this big leap of faith at the beginning, basically. And I realized that I was going to be burning some bridges. I realized that when I started talking about how the industry is controlled and what's really going on in the world, there are going to be certain people that are not going to want to associate with me anymore, because they're going to have the perception of me that I once had of David Icke, that I've gone off the rails and I've lost my mind. I realized that there are certain companies and certain organizations that I was not going to be able to work with anymore because they wouldn't want to have that association with me. And I'm totally fine with that now. But in the early days, of course, I worried because it was just such a big change from what I'd done before. But I just took this leap of faith and I embraced truth in creation. I am someone that has always wanted the truth of a matter. It doesn't matter how unsettling or disturbing it might be. I just need to know the truth. It seems some people are happy living in a bubble, living under illusions, living under mind control, brushing things off that don't sit well with them. I've never really understood that viewpoint because I've always wanted to know the truth. If truth is there to be uncovered, I need to do the uncovering. So I decided,
think, if I can say, I think, speaking for myself, obviously I do shows like this. We investigate claims of conspiracy all the time. I think that a lot of us just feel overwhelmed and, what do I do about it? How do I make a difference? If they have this kind of power, they can kill people, they can alter the ways of the world. I can sit here and go down a rabbit hole that leaves me feeling dark and despondent, or I can close my eyes and just try to make the best life I can. I think a lot of people kind of fit into that realm. It's just a feeling of incapacitation or helplessness. It's not that I want to be. I'd love to be able to do something about some of these issues, but I feel like I wouldn't, I don't want to put myself or my family in danger.
Well, I think it's clearer for some people what their role can be in terms of putting out truth and trying to make a difference to things than it is for others. I often get emails from people saying, thank you for your information. I completely accept what you're saying, but I don't know what I can do. I feel helpless. I feel powerless. And I get that. But with some people, a role does become clear, and you can see how you can participate in the process of trying to turn things around, or at least alerting as many people as possible as to the true nature of, what we all face. And that became clear to me. I realized that I had a background in radio. I had a background in writing. I used to be a staff editor on a business magazine many years ago, so I was used to communicating stuff in writing. I knew a lot about music. I had a lot of experience. I'd met a lot of the artists that I now talk about. So bringing all of that together, it became clear to me that I could become a voice that exposes all this stuff. And as I said earlier, there wasn't really anyone else doing this. So that role became clear for me, and that's what I've fully embraced. But yeah, for other people, it could become more of a problem knowing what to do about this whole thing.
Mark Devlin, guest, we have to take a break. We'll come back. We'll continue our discussion. If you have questions, our phone lines are open. You can also email me, dave@midnightinthedesert.com, or connect with me through the wormhole if you're one of our subscribers. And you can subscribe and get all that information at midnightinthedesert.com. Tonight, we're in search of the musical truth. Our guest, Mark Devlin. All right, Mark, I want to keep going deeper into this with you. Talk to me about, dealing in this industry and being out there on the road. And I'm sure you've made a lot of connections. Have you talked to any musicians, major musicians, about your thoughts on any of this?
Well, yeah, I met a lot of artists when I was working full-time as a DJ. So, unfortunately, some of the names I now expose as having been key players in these various agendas are ones that back in the day, 20, 25 years ago, I interviewed for the radio. And here I am reluctantly having to talk about their true nature. But since coming out with this type of work, I have been contacted by a lot of players in the music industry. Now, most of them wish to remain anonymous, understandably, so I'm not going to be banding names around. But yeah, I've had a lot of studio engineers and producers that have written to me to say, your work is spot on. So in the early days, as I mentioned earlier, I did worry about the validity of what I was putting out there, but I've got constant verification from people that actually it's 100% accurate in terms of what really goes on. So I've had people spilling the beans on processes that happen in studio production and things that get stripped into recordings as a matter of routine. I've had one or two low-level artists, not household name A-listers. Again, it's understandable why I wouldn't be getting emails from them, but lesser-known artists have confirmed that they've been made offers and invited to attend parties and events of certain natures in exchange for engineered fame and success. And thankfully, most of them declined, which is why you've never heard of them and they've not become household name artists. And that'll be the best thing that never happened to them. And I had a very well-known British producer reach out to me a couple of years ago and invite me to go and visit him, where he gave me a bunch of stories from, inside the industry as well. So I'm getting constant confirmation of the fact that the information I put out is absolutely correct. And it's come from many different sources. So it does tend to suggest that there is a lot of truth to what I talk about.
You said you want the truth. When you get it, though, sometimes is it too much? Are you like, oh, no, I want the truth, but this is not what I wanted to hear?
Well, I think I'm just so well seasoned with it all now that it takes a lot to shock me. I've heard and seen so much that I think I've developed a very thick skin towards it. Obviously, it becomes very distressing when you start getting into the bounds of pedophilia and child sexual abuse, which unfortunately is a very real thing. It does go on a staggering scale. And anyone would be deeply upset by hearing about that stuff, anyone that's got all their human faculties intact anyway. But outside of that, I've heard and seen a lot, and I've just come to accept that the world is nothing like I spent the first 40 years of my life being told it was. And it just becomes my responsibility to communicate what I find in terms of the true nature of things and put it across to people in whatever way that I can. And that's what I'm now doing. I never imagined that my life would turn out this way, but here we are.
What do you make of claims like John Lennon? It's one lone nut that, Catcher in the Rye inspired him to take the life of John Lennon. There's been so much more behind the scenes and conspiratorially saying that this was a political assassination, and that there was more to that. Do you dig into aspects of those stories as well?
Oh, sure. I've looked at the untimely deaths of so many prominent musicians. It becomes a complete quagmire of research, and there are so many lanes that you can be led off in if you're going to embrace all the information that's out there. So when it comes to John Lennon, you'll have people that tell you the official version of the story is absolutely correct, that Mark Chapman was just this lone deranged nut that got these crazy ideas in his head and decided to take Lennon out. You'll then have people that will tell you that Mark Chapman was actually a government-sponsored assassin, and he was working in conjunction with the CIA. He was a product of the MK Ultra mind control program and coming out of the CIA, and he was programmed to take Lennon out. Then you can go a step further, and there's this claim that the guy that actually assassinated Lennon was a well-known CIA Black Ops assassin by the name of Jose Perdomo, who was working as the doorman on the Dakota building in New York on that fateful night, and that Chapman had been programmed to assume a marksman's position and then take the rap for the killing. And he'd actually been programmed to believe that he'd done it so that he would confess to the police, allowing the real assassin Perdomo to get away. Then you go even further, and you'll have people who will claim that John Lennon's death was some kind of psyop hoax, and that actually he didn't die, and he's still living and performing as a musician today. This theory in particular comes from a researcher by the name of Miles Mathis, who claims that there was this Canadian movie many years ago called Let Him Be, and it features a musician by the name of Mark Stacer, who is a John Lennon impersonator. And Miles Mathis and others claim that this is actually the real John Lennon, who faded back into obscurity, and his death was, some kind of hoax that we were all duped by. So you can see you've got 4 different versions of what happened there, and as a researcher, you've got to try and pick through the pieces and see which one of those holds water. And that's just one such incident. You get into the death of Bob Marley and it becomes similarly convoluted. Same thing with Jim Morrison, same thing with Elvis Presley. Every time one of these high-profile artists passes away, there's just a whole host of conflicting stories and anomalies and discrepancies to go through. Same with Michael Jackson, same with Prince, same with Whitney Houston. So it can very easily become a full-time job, just trying to make sense of all this stuff. And you just have to go with your best speculation, because ultimately all we can do is speculate. Those of us that weren't present at any of these events don't know for sure what happened, but you do start to see some patterns. The more of these you look into, you see the same kind of trends emerging, and you can build a picture of what most likely went on and what we're being asked to believe. Certainly, MK Ultra as a mind control program coming out of the CIA is very real. It's documented that this took place, and certainly there were Manchurian candidate-style assassins that were being programmed to go out there and carry out killings on behalf of the agency and other interested parties. So that does play out into the music industry, and I think we've seen that several times over the decades.
People want their legends to transcend their tragic deaths. The concept that Elvis Presley is still alive, that yes. John F. Kennedy is still alive, that or survived that gunshot, that Lennon is still alive. Then you've got the other side of the coin. McCartney actually died in the 60s and has been replaced by a doppelganger. Yeah. And we want there to be, we want our celebrities to live forever. We want to accept different weird aspects that we would never consider about our neighbor. Right. But has any of these conspiracies, in your estimation, do they seem real? I know I mentioned this again just about a week ago. Gail Brewer Giorgio, who wrote considerably on the fake death of Elvis Presley.
Yeah.
I spoke with her a few years, I guess going probably about 8 or 9 years back. And she sent me a bunch of information, and she told me, she said, listen, I can't tell you if Elvis is alive today, but I can tell you that up until the early 2000s, his personal Social Security number was still paying taxes. I can tell you that there is on file an affidavit signed by Elvis Presley, like within a month of his death, in a Ponzi scheme that he helped break regarding mobsters. And he is now in protective custody, was her consideration for this. And she said that she had spoken to enough other people that knew inside things that he was still in fact alive. Is this crazy talk? Is there something to this aspect of any of these stories? Again, that sounds like manipulation by the government. Music, the power of these beings and who they were, what they represented, and how their words could affect and impact millions, was it better for the government to shift and manipulate these people, give them an out so that they were less dangerous?
Well, I think you have to look at every incident in isolation. You can't make a blanket statement such as every time we're told an influential artist has died, it's a hoax. And really, they've been inducted into some kind of witness protection program and just ushered out of the public spotlight to live out their remaining years out of sight somewhere. Certainly, that does happen, in my view, but it's not the case that it happens all the time. You also can't make a blanket statement that every time we're told an artist has died of some undisclosed overdose or suicide or other method of death, that it's absolutely as the mainstream media presented it to us. That's another blanket statement that I think it would be inaccurate to make. So you have to look at every case on its own merits. Having done that, I have my doubts about the official version of what we were told about certain artists. Elvis Presley would be one. I quote Gail in my first Musical Truth book in terms of some of the things she had to say, particularly about Elvis's funeral. She mentions at the service there at Gracelands, there was this very strange atmosphere around, almost like a carnival, like a sort of sideshow going on. And she states that the body in the casket seemed to have beads of sweat on it, and also that it appeared to be wearing a very bad toupee, and you could see some of the hair dye soaking into the skin of the individual there, suggesting that it wasn't actually Elvis in the casket. So there's red flag number one. Elvis is strongly rumoured to have been a government agent of some sort or other. It's been claimed that he worked for the DEA. It's been claimed that he worked in association with various police departments in the US, and that when he went on international tour, particularly in the early days, in the 1950s, going into the 60s, not that many pop artists were going all around the world on tour, and yet Elvis was. And it's been claimed that he was undertaking spying activities on behalf of, whoever his employers were when he was going out and doing these shows. So I wouldn't necessarily write any of that off, because a lot of it holds water in terms of stuff that I've seen. Then we can get into the likes of Jim Morrison of The Doors, who we're told turned up dead at the age of 27 in his apartment in Paris. He was discovered dead in a bathtub, so we're told, of some kind of overdose or other. It's never been adequately explained the way in which he died. A lot of artists rock up dead in bathtubs, actually. I call it death by bathtub. You find this quite often. So there were so many unanswered questions with Jim Morrison. The only other person that was supposed to have seen his body was his girlfriend, Pamela Courson. So we've only got her word for it that Jim actually did die in the bathtub. There was no coroner's report. And there are all kinds of other anomalous things with Jim Morrison, not least his family background, which has been gotten into many times, particularly through the work of Dave McGowan, who wrote the book Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, looking at that whole Laurel Canyon scene. So Jim Morrison's dad turns out to have been the Navy admiral in charge of the fleet of ships involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which springboarded America into the Vietnam War. So that's who Jim Morrison's old man was. So by blood there, by family, he's connected into the American establishment and the military-industrial complex. Other artists whose deaths I have some doubts about would include Tupac. I think there's a lot of unanswered questions there. David Bowie, I really don't know what to make of that one. But then you get other artists where, in my view, they very clearly were taken out. And these would include the likes of Prince, George Michael that we mentioned earlier, Dolores O'Riordan of the Cranberries, Amy Winehouse, and a few of the others. So like I say, I think you have to look at the detail for each one of these cases and try and figure out what may have gone on there. We do see a pattern of artists that have very public and major falling outs with their record companies, all seeming to end up the same way. It doesn't seem to be great for your life expectation when you enter into a legal wrangle with somebody like Sony or Warner Brothers, as Michael Jackson, Prince and George Michael did. It turned out the same way for all of them. So we have some little reminders there of the great power that those that control these industries have, and what can happen to you if you decide to stop playing ball and you become a bit of a loose cannon. And again, people will point to John Lennon in that regard and state that during the 70s he became, something of a political activist and something of a thorn in the side of the Nixon administration and the establishment in general, and that provided a reason for him being taken out. I'm very open
there's thick FBI files in
right.
Lennon or Nixon hated Lennon, it appears.
Yeah.
So there was quite a bit of political discourse regarding Lennon and his ability to reach the people.
Yeah, for sure. And Lennon was taken out right at the time of the incoming Reagan-Bush administration. I mean, many people will say that Bush ran that whole show and Reagan was just the front puppet. But yeah, it's right about the time that Reagan was running for president, and just before he was in office, John Lennon ends up getting shot. So I certainly wouldn't dismiss that John Lennon was taken out. I don't necessarily embrace this theory that his death was some kind of hoax. I have to remain open to the suggestion, but my gut instinct and my feeling is that he was genuinely taken out. And there was a radical personality shift that occurred with John Lennon at the time that he met Yoko Ono. During the Beatles' heyday, Lennon was very much the joker of the group. He was a clown. He was always larking about. He was, just making fun of everything. But when he met Yoko and the Beatles came to split and go their separate ways, he seemed to become a different person. People have said that Yoko was some kind of mind control handler that was sent into his world to have this control over him. But he seemed to become socially conscious. He joined various political activist movements. He started making incredibly thought-provoking and conscious music throughout the 1970s. And he seemed to be just a completely different guy to what he had been in the Beatles. And so it's not hard to understand how he may have got up the nose of the establishment of the time, because the last thing they want is a loose cannon going their own way, if this is what happened, and taking legions of fans with them and causing them to pay attention to things like the injustice of the Vietnam War and foreign occupation generally and social conditions in the US and beyond. That would be something that these controllers would have no interest in.
And a lot of people don't realize that they were trying to deport Lennon. He wouldn't leave for a long time because he was afraid he wouldn't be let back in. And he had finally won his citizenship and then was murdered not too long after, correct? So it was kind of like, all right, fine. You win this part of the battle, you're done.
Yeah, the timing becomes very interesting in that regard. He moved to the States in 1971 and took up residence in the Dakota Building in New York shortly after that and never returned to the United Kingdom. So, he didn't set foot in Britain from 1971 onwards. He very much made the US his home.
All right, so that's, the kind of the overture. Now, that would explain, because I was going to say, if they have this hired killer at the Dakota who takes out Lennon, then Mark David Chapman takes his stance and a switch is flipped in his mind to make him believe that he did truly kill John Lennon. How does that account for Yoko Ono, who was there and an eyewitness to the situation?
Well, this would suggest that Yoko was in some way complicit with what happened. It becomes interesting in this regard to look at some of her background. And again, we see some trends starting to emerge, which I've seen time and time again in so many stories that I've looked into. So family backgrounds are the key to so much in terms of who these people really are. It goes back to ancestry and genealogy and what previous generations of these certain families were involved in. So on her mother's side, Yoko Ono is descended from Japanese aristocracy and Japanese royalty, the family of the one-time Japanese emperor. So coming through the bloodline, that expresses itself through her mother. And then was the head of a very prominent and powerful banking dynasty in Japan. And he split his time between Japan and the US on business. So that's who her parents were. We learned that Yoko spent a time back in Japan in a mental institution, which won't be difficult for many people to accept. when they listen to her contributions to the Double Fantasy album, at least. But for me, that's another red flag, because it starts to bring in the possibility of mind control experimentation and programming. Whenever I hear of somebody spending some time in a hospital or a mental institution, that's the first thing that comes to my mind, because mind control programming is endemic throughout the entertainment industry. We find it everywhere. So that's a bit of Yoko's background. You know, she was married before she met John, and she had a child with her first husband. And then she hooks up with John, who had also been married and had a child before he met her, and the two of them get put together. So there is the suggestion there that she was sent in to have this control over him. And like I say, the bloodline family thing expresses itself so many times in the music industry. When you look at who the fathers and grandfathers were of some of these musicians, you find connections into the military, you find connections into the world of politics, you find connections into secret societies such as Freemasonry and Ian Club and the Century Club and Skull and Bones coming out of Yale and all this. So it becomes very interesting in terms of trying to establish who somebody really is. We often get these larger-than-life cover stories given to us as to where a particular artist came from. And the likes of Wikipedia will go to great lengths to try and convince people have just got to the top through sheer hard work and doing a bit of networking and hustling and crossing their fingers for good luck. That's the traditional story of how the Beatles made it. We're asked to believe that they're just four regular working-class lads from Liverpool that wrote a few catchy songs, put a few chords together on their guitars, formed a band, played a few gigs, worked really hard, and then against all the odds became the most popular and influential group in music history. I doubt there are many people out of the 7.5 billion that we're told are currently on the earth who have not heard of the Beatles. Do you really get that level of prominence and recognition off your own back, rather than placed there by those that can make these things happen?
Right time, right point in history, right new sound. You think that there's more of this Illuminati movement behind creating these monsters, these Frank Sinatra's, Elvis Presley's, the Beatles? You think that there's definitely that machine. It isn't just dumb luck and being the right mixture and catalyst at a time that the world needed it.
Absolutely. There are different ways that people are brought into the industry and promoted as these influential acts. Part of it is through the family bloodlines. Like I say, you have different generations of these same families, and the people coming out of them are given these public roles. So in one generation, you might have somebody that's ushered into a position in a mayor of some city or other, and then their offspring, it might be decided that they're going to be a well-known actor appearing in movies or on TV, or they're going to be a musician, and so they're sent off to get training in that skill, and they're made famous and influential through that kind of thing. Then you have what I refer to as the chosen ones, who are in the music industry, artists, groups, bands that start out organic. They do start out in that very way. They show some skill, they show some talent, and they do get to a certain level of success off their own back. But this gets noticed. The industry has spotters whose job it is to sniff out those that show great potential. And these people are then taken to one side and made an offer beyond their wildest dreams of fame and fortune and wealth and success, and all they've got to do is sign on the dotted line and do what we instruct you to do from this point on, and you will become that household name artist you've always wanted to be. And of course many artists fall for this because it's all they've ever wanted, but what they don't realize is the terrible nature of what it is they're getting into, because from that point forward they're no doing what they're told.
But then you hear of so many musicians who, powering through Roger Daltrey's book, you realize, according to him, he didn't even start making money in The Who until the 2000s because of the setup that was there before. But The Who, you could say was very influential in rock music and in politics and in kind of shaping the way people look at things. What do you make of that? Is that an aberration?
Well, we've got Roger's word for it there, and the question becomes, how much can you trust some of these lifetime actors, as I refer to them as. There's an official cover story for everything. There's a Wikipedia version of events. So every group out there, you'll find the official story of how they got started. But experience has taught me that when you dig beneath the surface and you don't necessarily accept what mainstream sources tell you about where these people came from, you often get some very different stories. That's what this alternative method of research is all about, and it really does throw up some rewards when you take that attitude towards things, I have found.
All right, we need to take another break. We're talking with our guest, Mark Devlin, Music as Mind Control. We'll dig deeper into this. Phone lines are open. You can hit me up through the wormhole. If you have questions, email me, dave@midnightinthedesert.com. We'll be right back. We're back. This is Midnight in the Desert. I've got to tell you, folks, going into the wormhole here for a question, Anonymous writes in and I don't understand your question. So if you'd like to call in, Anonymous, and be a part of the program, maybe specifically outline what it is you're saying without the curse word, we'd love to give you that opportunity. 520-600-6483. That's 520-600-6483. You can connect with me through the wormhole. You can also email me, dave@midnightinthedesert.com. That's what's going on, and that's how you can be a part of tonight's program with our guest, Mark Devlin, as we talk about music and mind control and who are the powers to be. Now, listen, maybe many of you are sitting back scratching your head or your chin thinking, this guy's nuts. It can't be that there's this kind of control going on. But I want to bring up one point for you folks. I have one name, one word that makes me believe there is definitely something to this. And if you're having trouble now, I just want to put this out there to you and realize the power this guy has in the music industry. Hasselhoff. How the hell did Hasselhoff ever become a thing in the music industry if he did not sell his soul to some form of Illuminati? And I don't mean that sarcastically, Mark. I can't figure the guy out. I can't figure out how some of these artists have blown up the way they have. And I love music. I love all music. But there's some of these you think, no, there's definitely a deal with some form of devil involved in getting these people to where they are.
Well, exactly. We all know of bands or singers that we feel don't have a huge amount of talent. And we all know other bands and singers, possibly personally, that we know have much more talent than these people that are served up to us. So the question becomes, how do certain names make it and others can spend an entire lifetime struggling and not getting that break? I mean, the same thing happens with radio DJs, as an aside. You know, I so wanted to be a very popular radio DJ back in the day, and I used to apply to all these big radio stations here in the UK, and I was constantly getting knocked back, and I couldn't understand why. But now, putting some perspective on it, I realized that they didn't want me because or maybe they spotted something in me that they didn't think could be shaped and molded into what they were looking for from their assets. And so that was a very lucky escape from me, that I didn't make it any bigger than I did, because I wouldn't be able to be putting this work out there if I had. But yeah, the question is, why do certain names make it? And when it comes to selling your soul for fame and fortune, I would suggest that that's a very real concept. People can scoff at it if they have no concept of the occult and supernatural and things such as this, but it is very real, and the individuals that control these industries very much believe in these powers that can be harnessed. So it doesn't matter whether you do or not. Your opinion is irrelevant to the dynamic that's taking place.
With that said, what do you make of the 27 Club? I mean, that is an eerie amount of musicians and musical artists that have died at the age of 27. And
well, that's
many
right.
of them come up out of obscurity into unbelievable supernova status and then gone.
That's right. You've got the likes of Robert Johnson, the blues musician, going right back to the 1930s, who was one of the early members of what that's referred to, the 27 Club. Then Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin. More recently, Amy Winehouse. You had Pete Ham of the group Badfinger. You had Ron Pigpen McCulloch of the Grateful Dead. All of these people rocked up dead at the age of 27. So Is that coincidence, or is there some occult signaling that's going on there? And then when it comes to these events,
Kurt Cobain, you got to mention. I mean, it's not just like, oh, well, this guy can
Kurt Cobain,
knock off 5 or 6 names, folks. This list is insanely long, and it covers a wide swath of musical legends. And it is crazy to look at how many names show up on this list. If you have not looked at the 27 Club listing, please check it out for yourself and see just how many people in the musical world that have seemed to have risen to stratospheric heights and then vanish all fit into this realm. It's pretty unbelievable. Is I think the easiest way to say it. Yeah.
Yeah, Kurt Cobain is another one. When it comes to events and parties, in inverted commas, that many of these artists are required to attend and take part in exchange for their success, if you watch the movie Eyes Wide Shut by Stanley Kubrick, I would suggest that we're getting a fairly accurate glimpse into what really goes on in these so-called elite circles there. And if anything, what was depicted in that movie will be fairly mild compared to some of the stories I've heard about initiation rituals that go on. People might want to listen to the work of Professor Griff, who was a one-time member of Public Enemy, or he stepped in and out of that group over the years. But Griff, in more recent times, has become a very vocal researcher into the true nature of the industry, and he's not backwards in coming forth when it comes to relating, what really goes on. He's got some stories about some very well-known names in the rap hip-hop field and what they've had to do in exchange for their engineered success, and their stories to make your hair curl, I'll tell you. And there are many other sources that have come to me as well and confirmed that this sort of stuff really does go on. So it's all manner of depravity and sickness that these people are required to take part in.
Can you give us a concept of that? I mean, to say, oh, there's some depravity, but I mean, and you talked earlier about pedophilia and some of the other things. Are they forced to do something like pedophilia in order for these organizations to get over on them?
I hear that does go on. Yeah. I hear that in exchange for you becoming a household name, if you're one of these so-called chosen ones and you don't come out of one of these family bloodlines, you are required to take part in these kind of depraved activities. There's this one particular ritual that I've been told about that comes out of Skull and Bones, the secret society fraternity in Yale University, which involves initiates having to lie naked in a coffin while their peers stand around them, and they then out their entire sexual history and take part in other activities that maybe we shouldn't talk about on the radio as part of their initiation into the upper ranks of the industry. That's been corroborated by various different sources. It's also something else that Professor Griff talks about, and various well-known politicians are said to have taken part in that routine as well. So it's not just musicians, it's anyone that's put into the public spotlight. It can be actors, it can be business leaders, television presenters, politicians, anyone you've heard of. The dynamic is the same in terms of how these people get served up to us. It's never by accident that these people become well known. They're always placed there by those that can make these things happen. And I would now go so far as to say that this is the case with all celebrities and all famous people. Once you reach a certain level, if you could stop the average person in the street and say, have you heard of such and such? And 10 out of 10 people will say, well, of course I have. I know who that is. Then that, to me, is a fairly sure indicator that that person has been placed into that position and is completely controlled and is completely an asset of the groups and the networks that run these industries. They didn't get there under their own steam. It doesn't happen that way. It never has since the inception of the industry. That's just the dynamic that's at play here.
Then you hear about people like Randy Quaid, who fell from grace. He played Cousin Eddie in the vacation movies, and he started ranting about these things called star whackers, right? That was his terminology for it, and that people were being manipulated, celebrities were being murdered. He was speaking up because he was afraid for his own life and thought by speaking up, and as insane and obscure as it sounds, he believes that by doing what he did and coming off the rails as he did, it kept him alive. What do you make of a claim like that with the Star Whacker theory?
Yeah, well, Randy's career has tanked, hasn't it,
exactly,
since he made that
sure.
comment, which is
right.
which is a fairly clear indicator that he could have been onto something. See, then you've got the likes of Jim Carrey, for instance, who has come out in recent years talking about spirituality and consciousness and how he's made these amazing discoveries about our true nature. And I don't buy his routine for a second, because to me, Jim Carrey bears all the hallmarks of having been mind-controlled himself. And it wouldn't surprise me if when we see him in all these movies and he's taken on all these different roles and they're all larger than life and he's, acting crazy, if those are mind control alternative personalities that he's slipping into as a part of his programming. So like Jim Carrey, because he's right up there as an A-list household name that everyone's heard of. Somebody like Randy Quaid is quite a few levels below the likes of him. He's a few rungs down the ladder. And so when he comes out and says something like that, to me, it's far more convincing. And also, as I say, the fact that Randy doesn't seem to work anymore does suggest that he may have peed certain people off. However, I think he was probably giving us an insight.
The problem I have is that Randy didn't say this when he was clean-shaven and during any part of his career. It was all of a sudden he's got this wild man Duck Dynasty Bush beard going. He looked like a madman in everything he was doing, and then starts ranting and raving. Was it because he was trying to, in your opinion, and this is just your opinion, was it he was losing his mind because he was pulling away, because everything that he loved was being taken away from him, and that's what was pushing him to finally reveal this hand?
In my opinion, yes, that is what's happening there. And I'm reminded of the story that we were told by Dave Chappelle, the comedian. A few years ago, he started revealing the true nature of who runs his industry, and he was talking about having been made certain offers and they wanted to step him up a few levels, and he wasn't interested in being a part of that, and he made it clear that he wasn't. And during this whole routine, he related the story of Martin Lawrence, the comedy actor, Hollywood actor, who he says at one point was out there in the street running around waving a gun and screaming to anyone that will listen, "They're trying to kill me, they're trying to kill me." And in this particular routine where Dave is relating that story, he asks what makes a normally strong and altogether individual like Martin Lawrence go that crazy and start acting in that way if there's not some validity to what he's saying. So he's suggesting that, Martin Lawrence discovered some stuff about what goes on in the industry and what happens to you if you don't play ball, and it panicked him. And what we're seeing there is a genuine reaction from somebody that is not in control of their situation. And we probably saw the same thing there with Randy Quaid. I think a lot of these people get in above their depth, and only some way down the line do they discover the terrible nature of what it is they're involved with. And they probably feel that by that point, they've got no reasonable way out. And obviously that's going to panic somebody, and you're not going to have any idea what to do.
Nancy writes back in and says, to clarify my question through the wormhole, I'm a boomer, 62 years old. I love Queen and Freddie Mercury. I need my music. How do we not support this without giving up our life source of music? And then she brings up an interesting point. By the way, Pete Townsend was accused of pedophilia. How do we correct this? And, talking about that, it just kind of shifted something into this perspective. Roger Daltrey kind of talking about how he didn't make any money. Pete Townsend made the lion's share of the money because he was the author and curator of much of the music. Roger Daltrey, just the singer. And Pete Townsend is the one that made all the money and was in this. Now, Pete Townsend, they allegedly found child pornography on his computer that he claims was while he was doing research for his book. But it got pushed away pretty quickly. And it's as though maybe he did fold back into the, I'm just taking the outlier position here. Maybe he folded back in and they said, oh, okay, yes, it's all cleared up because he didn't turn. But in recent days, in the recent articles, he seems to be cracking again, Pete Townsend. He talks about how he doesn't like this industry, hasn't liked being a part of the Who since the 60s. he's not really in control of what's happening. And it's really interesting hearing your aspects of this and reading what he's been saying, and then getting off of that child pedophilia, the parent, what was it, child pornography, getting the pictures and such. It is pretty interesting that just kind of dissolved for him.
Yeah. There seems to be certain grades in the industry in terms of where people fit in.
If you kiss the ring, if you'll go back and kiss the ring, will they make it all good for you again?
Well, we had that situation with Pete Townsend where he was allegedly discovered with child pornography on his computer. And he got away with it, seemingly by saying he was researching. He believed that he was sexually abused as a child himself, and he was trying to understand the subject more, so he was just doing research. And that appeared to wash in terms of the police accepting his story. Then we can look at somebody like Gary Glitter, the 70s glam rock star. He was discovered with child pornography on his computer when he took it in for repair in a PC World store in Bristol sometime in the 90s. And he was absolutely thrown under the bus. So he went to jail for that. There have been many more cases he's been accused of child pornography, and he's been in and out of jail in various countries for the past several years. And his name is complete mud now. You know, his reputation has been tarnished beyond repair. You've only got to mention Gary Glitter's name in the UK and people just start spitting at the very mention of it. He's never going to work again. He's public enemy number one. So why do some people get thrown to the dogs and others seem to be able to regain their careers? It is interesting that Pete Townsend is now talking about, you know, regretting being a part of the Who and not having been enjoying it, because it does lend weight to the idea that people are forced into these roles in certain cases, and they maintain these long careers because they have to. What makes me curious is why the likes of Mick Jagger, Paul McCartney, whoever he really is, or perhaps I should say Sir Mick Jagger, put it into some context, Sir Paul McCartney, Sir Elton John, Sir Tom Jones, Sir Cliff Richard, why these people are still touring in their 70s and 80s when you would think that anyone of that age would just want to kick back and take it easy. They've got the mansions, they've got the yachts, they've got the sports cars. Would you not think they would just want to enjoy all that when most of these guys could have retired 25, 30 years ago and not have a single financial worry? And yet here they all still are, touring and putting out albums and doing chat shows at their age. My thinking on that is that these people aren't allowed to retire. They are lifetime actors. They've been gifted these careers, and they've had all the trappings and the fame and the fortune and the wealth and the material riches. But in exchange for that, they've got to do what they're told for the rest of their days and continue making money for the industry and continue having that influential effect on the public. I would suggest that it's not really any kind of quality life worth having. People revere these rock stars and put them up on a pedestal and wish that they could have amazing, opulent lives like them. But I think the truth of the matter is that most people are better off right where they are, with their personal freedom intact, able to do what they want, not being directed and controlled in every aspect of their lives. Just going back to the question that came about how can we still enjoy music. Yeah, it's a difficult one because we discover all these things about who these artists most likely really are and what the agenda was behind them being put on the pedestal in the first place. I think it's just a case of being mindful of that and getting informed, looking at alternative information in terms of who these artists are, where they come from, what their true roles may be. But it doesn't mean you can't continue to enjoy their music. There's a reason why these people have become as popular as they are, and it's mainly because their music is so damn good, because they get the best training and they work with the best studio engineers, the best producers, and the best songwriters. So their output is great. Otherwise, they wouldn't win over as many fans as they do. And good music is good music wherever it came from. So as long as you're mindful of the fact that these agendas are at play and that many of your favorite artists might not be the people you thought they were, I don't see any reason why you can't continue to enjoy music. I'm someone who's always loved music. I can't imagine life without it. it does uplift me. It does give me what I need at so many points in my life, even when I know that the artists aren't necessarily the people that I thought they were. So I think it's a case of people getting informed, getting streetwise, and being mindful of the way that the industry really works. But having done that, there's no reason why you can't still enjoy this music, and it can't still have that uplifting effect in your life that it always has.
Is the music, though, controlling us? Is there subliminal messages? Are there things that are affecting us in negative ways with this music, in your opinion?
In many cases, yes, that is going to be happening. And this becomes a contentious issue because some people have accused me over the years of continuing to endorse music and continuing to encourage people to listen to it when there's nefarious stuff happening below the surface. And again, it comes down to being informed. My belief is that you can break a mind control spell by becoming aware of how the trick is performed. I always liken it to a stage illusionist. You know, he could be up there performing some seemingly incredible feat, this miraculous illusion, and nobody can understand how he's achieving it. The minute he breaks down his tactics and says, well, this is how I achieved this apparent miracle, really it was just down to this sleight of hand, then that trick is no longer going to have its effect on you. The next time you see it, you're going to think, I know how this is performed. The spell has been broken. And so it is with all these tricks and tactics that are used in music. When you become aware of the methods, you can break the spell and it no longer has that influence on you. But certainly stuff that goes on. There's a story that I relate in Musical Truth Volume 1 of this guy that used to work in the music industry, again, coming out of one of these important family bloodlines. You know, he traced his family back way into the ancient world. They've been occultists. They've been involved in various different things. And he was ushered into a prominent position in the music industry in the 1970s. So there's an expression of that dynamic, how these people are put into these roles where they can have this effect and where these industries are populated by people who are controlled. They're not operating to their own agendas. They're doing what they're told. This guy went by the name of John Todd, also known as John Todd Collins or Lance Collins. And there's a famous monologue of his that you can still get on YouTube where he's talking some 1970s of how it was standard practice back then for all the big major record companies to have an altar room in their corporate HQ where they would take the master tape of an album that they wished to put out. This was in the days of analog tape still. They would take it into this altar room and they would bring in a group of witches who would perform a ritual on this master tape. And the idea was that they would be imbuing it with certain malevolent energy so that every copy that's made of that tape in terms of the albums or cassettes or whatever it is that get put out into the marketplace carries some of that signature energy out to the buyer with them. So John Todd talks quite openly about this having been the case, and others have backed up that story as well. We can only speculate as to how things are done now in the digital electronic age where we're not using analog technology anymore, assuming this process still goes on. But there's an insight into what could be carried in some of these recordings. So again, people might say, well, how can you suggest that people still continue to listen to this music when this sort of thing is going on? And again, it just comes down to being aware that it's happening. It's like the power of advertising, you know. Advertising companies make no bones about the fact that they're using hypnotic suggestion and psychological tricks to try and sell you stuff. And when you fall for the tricks, you might find yourself going out and buying a particular product because you've absorbed an ad into your subconscious mind, but you've not been consciously aware that you have. But the minute these tricks and tactics and methods are explained to you, that kind of process is not likely to happen again. You're not likely to go out and buy something because it's lodged itself into your subliminal mind. Once it enters the confines of the conscious mind, now you can understand what was done and you can make informed decisions. You're no longer operating out of your subconscious. So this is a process that takes place very often in the music industry.
All right, we are going to have to take another break. We've got one segment left together, and if you have questions, 520-600-6483, 520-600-6483. Continue to send them in to me through the wormhole. If you are a subscriber, you can find that information at midnightinthedesert.com. If you are unable to do that, you can email me, dave@midnightinthedesert.com, and I will try to work your questions, thoughts, ideas, and concerns in through the remainder of tonight's program. Fascinating stuff, scary stuff. A question from Keith when we return, and I'll put it in your lap now to consider for answering. He says, I'm more of an instrumental music fan, jazz, etc. I'm not into the lyrics. Is there any mind control in just the music itself? We'll talk with our guest, Mark Devlin, when we return about that. You're listening to the best in anomalous and thought-provoking conversational talk radio. This is Midnight in the Desert. Mark Devlin, our guest. He's the author of Musical Truth Volume 1, Musical Truth Volume 2, and The Cause and the Cure. We have links up for Mark's information, his websites, his YouTube channels, and to the buy the books. It's all up at midnightinthedesert.com. Go check it out for yourself. Before the break, Mark, I dropped in your lap the question from Keith. He says, I'm more of an instrumental music fan, jazz, etc. I'm not into the lyrics. Is there any mind control in just the music only, or is it lyrical that causes the mind control?
Sure. Well, I've addressed this in some recent lectures that I've done. First of all, we have the interesting case of 432 versus 440 hertz, which seems to come up in every conversation I ever have about the effect of music. This is the standard tuning pitch to which recordings and musical instruments are set and have been for the past several decades. So going back to the early part of the 20th century, 432 hertz was the standard tuning pitch, where the A note is pitched to 432 and all the other notes fall into accordance with that. Many musicologists and students of sound and producers, musicians themselves, will tell you that 432 is a natural harmonic frequency for music to be set to. It's in sync with the rhythms of the earth itself. It's in sync with human biology. It's a frequency that occurs in nature and is very much attuned with creation generally. Well, it turns out that round about the time of the Second World War, or just after, the standard tuning pitch around most of the world was changed from 432 to 440 hertz. And these same musicologists will tell you that 440 is anything but a harmonic frequency. In actual fact, it's in extreme discordance with these natural rhythms that 432 attunes so well with. And so 440 creates a state of agitation and disturbance in the listener without them being consciously aware of it. So doesn't it speak volumes that this was adopted as the standard tuning pitch? And so most recorded music that you hear now, and much of the stuff that you'll hear performed live, if the musicians don't know any better and don't take steps towards it, will be pitched at 440. Incidentally, it was those nice people at the Rockefeller Foundation that were responsible for instigating this switch back in the day. That's quite a surprise, isn't it? Then we can get into some of the methods that have been used in music composition through the ages. There's a concept known as the tritone, which is an interval between notes, which is 3 whole tones apart. And this is said also to be very dissonant and discordant to a human listener. It's said to create levels of distress when it's heard. It was reportedly banned by the Catholic Church in centuries past because of the effect that they felt it was having on church congregations when they were exposed to music that incorporated the tritone. We hear that this method has been used in rock music fairly actively through the decades. A good example of the tritone, as it's been explained to me, occurs at the start of Purple Haze by Jimi Hendrix, where you get that guitar riff coming in. That's a tritone in action. Then we have this method known as a sawtooth wave. When you look at a sound wave of a recording under an oscilloscope that enables you to see the frequencies in their full display, you often get this very jagged shape that occurs, and it's known as a sawtooth wave. This is similarly said to be quite disturbing to listen to. This has been incorporated very heavily into heavy rock and heavy metal through the decades. So there's all these different methods that have been employed in music production, and that brings us all the way up to where we are, digital electronic age. I've done a lot of work looking into the true nature of electronic dance music, which truly is a worldwide phenomenon. This stuff is listened to in literally every corner of the world. Young people are going out every single weekend to clubs and to dance festivals and listening to all this stuff. It's now completely produced electronically. It's all down to the sound frequencies. And I'm pretty convinced that there is stuff that's getting stripped into recordings that are getting heard at these gatherings, being lapped up by young people, because it's always young people, the youthful generations, that are in the crosshairs of the controllers of these industries. They don't bother with people of my generation. You know, we're finished as far as they're concerned. They just want young hearts, young minds, young. And so the electronic dance music scene is perfect for manipulation of vast numbers of young people. When you think of the MP3 encoding process that we now have, so many people are listening to the music in the form of MP3s. And with these files, for the sake of convenience and for the sake of easy transfer of data, what they do is take a full frequency file where all the data is intact, and the MP3 encoding process strips away a lot of the data that is deemed imperceptible to the human ear. So it might be certain frequencies or certain aspects of a bass line or certain aspects of an instrument that are taken out of the recording. But as far as the human mind that is processing that recording when it's listened to is concerned, it's all still there because the mind fills in the blanks. So in other words, you've got information that's missing, but nobody's really noticing. So it strikes me that if that can be the case, then the reverse must also be true, and you must be able to strip stuff into music recordings that are imperceptible, that will get absorbed by the subliminal mind of the listener and absorbed into their very being, but without there being any conscious recognition of it. So I think this is what's going on with a lot of electronic music now. And when we get into the agendas that are being pushed by dance music, this worldwide phenomenon, we get into all kinds of aspects of social engineering. This scene is being used big time to promote ideas of transhumanism and artificial intelligence. And we see this with all these massive dance music festivals. The themes are always the same. The clues are often in the names of many of these events, Tomorrowland, Digital Dreams, and things such as this. They're letting you know that they're pushing these transhumanist AI ideas, but it's all being done under the radar, under the guise of entertainment and fun and having a good time and being subversive. It's a masterclass in social engineering. And what we're seeing now through electronic dance music is just the latest in a long line of tactics to sell these ideas to people below the threshold of their conscious mind.
What is the overall in this? Are they pushing consumerism? Are they pushing political agendas? Are they pushing multiple messages in one layer? And I know that, you know, there in radio, there are multi-layers to a song that are being played so that they can give messages of what the song title is, who the song is sung by. Any myriad of information is digitally being processed through your radio. So to my understanding, it would be nothing to add another layer sub-frequency that our brains would pick up, but our ears would not necessarily discern.
Well, that's right. There was a story a few years ago that emerged of a trial that was taking place on German public trains, where they were beaming subliminal messages into the trains, but they were not able to be heard. So it was done on a sub-audio level. And it was basically subliminal messages that were being put into the minds of the travelers on these trains that was telling them to go and buy stuff. It was advertising messages. And people were getting off these trains with reports of having had these messages transferred to them, but they didn't hear it at any point. It wasn't there in audio form. So again, it was below the threshold, and it was put into the mind in the form of suggestibility like that. In terms of what they are trying to achieve with this whole thing, the push towards transhumanism and AI is the big thing right now, because that's where society is headed. We've got the 5G smart grid Internet of Things not really just around the corner, but already upon us. And they're trying to make all this palatable and make it acceptable to young people. And so they're pushing it through things like electronic dance music. They're doing it through movies and TV shows and all this other stuff as well. But clearly, dance music and its popularity around the world has been identified as a major way to sell these ideas to people. They want this AI futurist society that we've got to be seen as trendy and cool and not something to be feared, but something to be embraced by the youthful generation of these times. And so they're doing whatever they can to make that palatable. But through the decades, there have been many different agendas that have been pushed through music, through popular culture, through entertainment. So back in the 60s, when you had the counterculture scene, the hippie flower power era, the psychedelic rock era, that was all about basically the subversion of morals and the degradation of morality in society. It was to do with changing attitudes towards sexuality, changing attitudes to do with drug use, changing attitudes to do with the family, familial relations, driving a wedge between the generations, putting the young people at the time at odds with their parents' generation, and just creating this sort of social unease. The controllers of these agendas just wanted to see what would happen if they could get vast numbers of young people to be at odds with established society and their elders. Massive social experimentation was going on. And you've had the birth of feminism, which can be seen to have been yet another tool coming out of the CIA. Gloria Steinem with her whole movement and Ms. Magazine and all of this. She turns out to have been an asset of the CIA, putting all these changes into society at the behest of the social engineers that work in conjunction with military intelligence operations. So you've had all these different agendas through the ages. More recently, you've had the push towards transgenderism and the whole LGBTQ agenda. This is not a swipe at anybody's chosen lifestyle. What I'm talking about here is social engineering agendas, things that are put into place by individuals whose job it is to change society and change attitudes towards things. We're going back to the domain of Edward Bernays here, known as the father of propaganda, the inventor of the concept of public relations, coming out of Austria. He was the double nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he put out a famous book in 1928 called Propaganda. And I'll just read a very quick excerpt from it here because it really sums up the dynamic that I'm talking about. He stated almost 100 years ago in 1928, "We are governed, our minds are moulded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind, who harness old social forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world." That's the way it was being done in 1928, and it's not a whole lot different in 2020. The names and the tactics and the methods have changed, but the program is still the same.
That's powerful. What does that tell us then about our lives? How do we control it if every aspect of our lives is under govern of this music or subliminal messages, whether we're on a train or in a plane, on a boat with a goat? It seems like we're going to be bombarded. How do we stop any of this?
You've got to unplug as far as you can from what my friend Charlie Freak refers to as organized society, which is all these different groups and networks and organizations that work in conjunction with each other to sell us norms. There are normal ways of life, in inverted commas. So you're entrained and programmed. Go out and eat food from certain fast food restaurants, watch certain TV programs, listen to certain music, to participate in the banking system and do a job and pay taxes and all of this. These are normal, in inverted commas, ways of living. But the on somebody else's terms. So these have all been invented by the controllers of society, and most people don't think to question them, so they just fall into line with them, and that's why the vast majority of people that we know are termed, or could be termed normies, because they just participate willingly in all of this. So it's a case of unplugging from it, and it's a case of embracing truth in creation, because truth is a very real and very powerful thing. And we're going into spiritual and metaphysical realms here. We're getting out of 3D physical reality, and we're getting into the true nature of who we are, where we come from, what this life experience is. It's a case of embracing truth, which is inherent in creation. There is objective morality in truth. There's right behavior, there's wrong behavior that we can choose to align ourselves with. Karma is very real. Consequences, cause and effect, these different laws and principles do govern our lives, whether we choose to accept it or not, or like it or not. These dynamics are in place. And so if we can gain an understanding and a recognition of this and align ourselves with truth in creation and try and take right action wherever it's possible for us to do so, we can be free sovereign beings and exist outside of these control methods that have been set up to ensnare and trap us, escape the mind control, and take control of our own lives and our own behaviors and our own states of consciousness. It's very possible to do this. It's something I've been working on over the years in conjunction with doing this research. The more I understand about how we're in every aspect of our lives, the more it becomes clear how you can step outside of that and live freely if you choose to do so, if the will and the intent is there.
All right. Randy writes in and says, I joined the show a little late. Did your guest comment on Hendrix's death being intentional, as I've heard this from another researcher? Also, what about Page's use of black magic in connection with Crowley in making Zeppelin the force and influence it was? His use of the bow was to potentially attract demon entities. And does Plant still think that Page was responsible for the death of his son and other pitfalls that befell Zeppelin?
Okay, well, with regard to Hendrix, it certainly appears to be the case that his death occurred at the hands of his manager, a guy by the name of Mike Jeffrey, who it turns out had connections into British military intelligence. And we're told that the coroner that was on the case of Hendrix's death reported that he was absolutely saturated in red wine and that it was coming out of his lungs, it was coming out of his nose. It appears that he drowned on wine, which had been forcibly put into him. We have this fairly ridiculous official story that he choked on some kind of barbiturates and, choked on his own vomit, which appears to be an element of mockery going on there, because the alternative word is that he was actually forced to drown on this wine, and that Mike Jeffrey was the guy that instigated this. It was partially to do with royalties over Hendrix's publishing, financial aspects of the industry, but I'm sure there were occult ritualistic aspects of what went on as well. Well, it seems karma came a knocking for Mike Jeffrey, because a few years later, I think it was 1974 or somewhere around there, he died in a plane crash. He was on his way to London from Mallorca to go into a court case talking about Hendrix's financial affairs, and his plane went down over the French Alps, I think, and so that was the end of Mike Jeffrey. In terms of Jimmy Page and Led Zeppelin, Page is a very well-known advocate of the teachings of Aleister Crowley. He was seemingly obsessed by the guy. Jimmy Page had an occult bookstore, which he used to run in London for a time. And he also famously bought Aleister Crowley's Boleskine house, which he had on the shores of Loch Ness up there in Scotland, which I visited months ago. It burnt down to the ground, or a large part of it burnt to the ground a few years ago, just before Christmas 2015. And so it's now in ruins, but there is still one wing, one side of the house that remains intact. And it's in a very remote location up on a hillside, surrounded by security wire and stuff. But I did manage to get through, and curiosity got the better of me. So I went up there and took a few photographs a few months ago, and it's definitely got an air about it. It's a very unsettling place, I would say, in terms of its energetic state. Jimmy Page bought it in 1971. He sold it in 1991, and reportedly he spent no more than during the entire 20 years that he owned it. So I wonder why that would be. But Page was definitely an advocate of Crowley's. He was definitely into ceremonial magic and ritualistic activity. I'd not really heard much about the rift between him and Robert Plant and the death of his son that your listener just mentioned there. Don't know a whole lot about that. But given that Page has dabbled in dark occultism to the degree that he has, I would say anything is possible on that front.
His final point says Iron Butterfly's bass player's death when he was working on classified projects and time travel teleportation. Does your guest know anything about that? And that all comes from Randy.
Unfortunately not. I don't know anything further about that, I'm afraid.
That's news to me. I had no idea.
Oh, yeah, me too.
I mean, I guess it shouldn't surprise me so much when you've got Brian May as an actual rocket scientist, right? From the band Queen. Sometimes you forget that they have lives outside of the music and the work that they do.
Yeah, well, he's a fake astrophysicist. That's one of his lifetime actor roles. Fake? Well, in my view, yeah, he's pitching a fake version of our cosmology, and he's out there with the likes of Brian Cox and Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye in just putting all this disinformation out there and propping up NASA official versions of things. All of that is just a whole load of nonsense to me. I mean, we're getting into a whole different subject area here, but I don't accept any of that. I mean, to me, Brian May is a classic example of a lifetime actor, which is one of these people that's served up to us. And we think of them as a musician or an actor or a television presenter or a politician, but their real role is in their extracurricular activities, in the other stuff that they're pushing, in the agendas that they're propping up. And that's where they have their real worth and value to the controllers. So they're given these careers and they're obviously made very rich, but they're the whole time doing the bidding of those that tell them what to do and what messages to put out there. I think he's a really good example of that. Mick Jagger would be another one.
All right, Mick Jagger, in what sense? We've only got about 2 or 3 minutes left together, but I'm curious where that goes.
Well, Mick Jagger came out of the London School of Economics, which is one of these breeding grounds for the social engineers. The Fabian Society came out of the LSE. It's linked to the Tavistock Institute and the Frankfurt School and all these social engineering think tanks that shape and mould societal attitudes and such. So what are the chances, really, of somebody that studied at the LSE then going on to become this outrageous, subversive rock star, living this, crazy lifestyle, if they've not been put into that role in order to have an influential effect on people? I've got an anecdote from somebody that got in touch with me, actually, who says that one time they found themselves sat on a plane next to Mick Jagger in first class, naturally. And he was well oiled, he'd had a drink or two, and he was getting a bit loose-tongued. And he told this person, my role is to encourage people to embrace their base primal instinct, their sort of primal desires, living through the lower chakras. That's what sex and drugs and rock and roll is all about. And he said, my role all these years has been to get people to embrace that side of themselves, that animalistic side of themselves, and live in that way. So, I've no way of knowing whether that's a true story or not, but it wouldn't surprise me if that turned out to be the case. And there he is spilling the beans on what he's been doing all these years and why he started out in the London School of Economics and ended up as one of the world's most famous rock stars.
Mark Devlin, fascinating, weird, wild stuff. Here's the deal, folks. He outlines it completely in much more detail instead of the glossary images we've been giving tonight on the show. 2 hours doesn't seem like enough. Get a copy of the books, read them for yourself. Remember to do me a favor, rate and review all those books as well so that they get out in the hands of others and they can hear about this. Mark, thank you so much for coming on and giving us 2 hours of your time tonight.
No worries, man. It flew by, didn't it?
It did. Way too fast. Thank you so much for being a part of the show. We appreciate it. And we thank all of you for tuning in and being a part of the program with us as well. We hope you like and can enjoy nights like this when we go off the beaten path of ghosts, monsters, myths, and UFOs and look into strange conspiratorial angles. I'd love to hear from you email-wise. What do you think of topics like this and the guests that we bring on? Is it fascinating, frightening, or just too far out? You can email me, Dave, at midnightinthedesert.com. Give us your insights, thoughts, and ideas on that. We will be back tomorrow night. Tomorrow night, we got another great show lined up for you. Dan Moldia, The Irishman, Fact or Fiction. If you have not yet had a chance to see The Irishman on Netflix, fascinating movie about the underworkings of the mob and the lives of JFK, Jimmy Hoffa, and so many others, and what actually happened according to the Irishman himself, Frank Sheeran. Tomorrow we're going to hear more of the fact or fiction regarding that. Morgan Daimler joins us as well, UFOs and fairy lore as part of the program, so I hope you'll tune in and check that out. It's been a pleasure. Thank you all for being here with us. We'll see you again tomorrow on the best and anomalous talk radio. I'm Dave Schrader, and you've been listening to Midnight in the Desert. Honey, I'm coming home.
Midnight in the desert, shooting stars across the sky. This magical journey will take us on a ride, filled with the longing, searching for the truth. Will we make it till tomorrow? Will the sun shine on you? Midnight in the desert, and we're listening.